Welcome, everyone. My name is Carlo Basta. I am one of the two co-directors of the Center on Constitutional Change. It is the Center's pleasure to host this very timely panel with an absolutely stellar and accomplished group of scholars. They're all experts on power sharing and have a wealth of expertise on Northern Irish politics. The discussion will be moderated by Professor Allison McCulloch of Brandon University in Manitoba, Canada. Professor McCulloch will be joined by Professor Brendan O'Leary, who is at the University of Pennsylvania in the US, and Dr. Clare Rice, who is with the University of Liverpool. So a true transcontinental panel, though Professor O'Leary is in Ireland currently. So good afternoon, but also good morning to everyone. I could, of course, say much more about each one of our panelists, but I would rather that you hear from them than from me. So just by way of a last word from me, thank you all for joining us. Of course, thank you to our panelists, and please do enjoy the event. Professor McCulloch, the floor is all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carlo, and very much looking forward to today's event. Last week's Assembly election has been described by some as historic. Indeed, we can probably point to at least three major sort of moments of change stemming from that election. The first of which is that Sinn Féin garnered the most seats in the Assembly, meaning that for the first time in the history of Northern Ireland, a nationalist party has the most seats, and the first time that they will be able to nominate a first minister. The second moment is what we might call the so-called alliance surge, right? So the Alliance Party, a non-aligned other party, had its best election outcome ever, garnering 17 seats in the Assembly. And third, the election has ramifications for the Northern Ireland Protocol, with the DUP currently suggesting that they will not be nominating members of the executive until the protocol is either significantly amended or scrapped altogether. So each of these developments will impact the future of power sharing in Northern Ireland, with the prospect of getting the Assembly and executive up and running looking a little unlikely, at least in the short term. So our discussion today will really focus broadly on the question of what the 2022 Assembly election portends for the power sharing arrangements in Northern Ireland. So I thought we would start with just a quick overview of how those institutions work, and then move into our discussion for today. So under the terms of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, there are a number of novel institutional rules that require parties to work together. This includes the posts of First Minister and Deputy First Minister, which despite the names share the same responsibilities. An executive that is open to all parties that have sufficient support, with portfolios allocated on the basis of the party strengths in the Assembly. So a mechanism called sequential portfolio allocation. There are also community designations whereby members of the Assembly designate as nationalist, unionist, or other. Key decisions then require cross-community support using parallel consent or weighted majority using those designations. And finally, elections are also run in multi-member constituencies using the single transferable vote electoral system by which voters rank all the candidates in terms of their preferences. So just to get a little bit more handle on some of those institutional rules, I'd like at this point maybe to turn to Clare to say a little bit more about STV and maybe to speak to any trends in terms of preference transfers and so on coming out of this election. So Clare.
That's good. Thank you, Allison. So we have the single transferable vote system here in Northern Ireland, and as Allison has explained, essentially what happens whenever voters here go into the voting booth, we, instead of putting an X in a box beside a preferred candidate, we put our candidates in rank order. So our favourite candidate, we put a 1 beside them, second favourite 2, then 3, and so forth. You can fill as many boxes or as few boxes as you wish, but that's the way it works. What happens then is the ballots are all collected, they're taken to count centres, and there's a first stage of counting that happens. So that determines the number of valid votes that there are. So those are votes that essentially they're ballots that haven't been eliminated in some way. So perhaps somebody has written something on it that they shouldn't have, or incorrectly outlined their preferences, for example. So they're discarded, and a quota then is established. So that's on the basis of the number of valid votes that are cast within a constituency. divided by the number of seats for that constituency plus 1. And this quota is really important because that's essentially the finish line that the candidates need to reach in order to be deemed elected. Now, what happens thereafter is there's a process of counting that happens. Some of those counts can be done relatively quickly. Some of them can have to be done 10, 11, sometimes 12 times. It can be a long drawn out process, as we saw with some of the counts this year. But essentially what happens is that there's a process of elimination at one end where those candidates with the lower votes start to be taken out of the count process. And then what happens is their votes are redistributed to those candidates still in the race. And then we have a redistribution of surplus. And what's meant by that is that those candidates that are deemed elected and cross that quota finish line that I mentioned, any votes that are beyond that quota line then are redistributed as a fractional vote. So essentially the votes are sifted down in such a way that the aim ultimately is to fill all 5 seats within the constituency, returning 5 candidates per 18 constituencies, making up 90 MLAs in the Assembly.
Wonderful. Thanks, Claire. One of the other, again, novel institutional rules is how the executive is formed. Some people have called it a mandatory coalition, but Brendan, I'm wondering if you might want to say a little bit more about how the coalition is formed using that sequential portfolio allocation model.
There are 3 aspects to the Northern Executive that require attention. First, there is a dual premiership. This was invented by the Ulster Unionist Party and the Social Democratic and Labour Party in negotiations in 1998. Under the original model, the 2 premiers were elected together by a concurrent majority in the Assembly, consisting of a majority overall and a majority of those who designate as nationalists and a majority who designate as unionists. That was changed at the St Andrews Agreement, thereby removing the requirement that the 2 parties that were most successful would have to cooperate directly in voting for one another's candidates. Under the new procedures, the party that wins the most seats is automatically entitled to the First Minister position. The second position is filled by the party that is largest in the designation that has not already had a premiership. There are some anomalies there that we can come to if necessary. So one feature is the dual premiership, and that has been the most controversial part of the settlement because the 2 are tied together and because both posts have to be filled together and because initially they had the right of dissolution of the Assembly to trigger elections within 6 weeks. They have been the lightning rod for any difficulties between the partners. Originally, the plan of the design reached in Good Friday was to have the rest of the executive allocated according to the D'Hondt rule. As Allison has correctly said, this means that in sequence, parties get a chance to pick their preferred portfolios among the remaining available seats. As a result of recent changes, the number of ministries is confined to 7 in total. There's 1 extra ministry, the Ministry of Justice, and its position is anomalous. Because unionists are utterly hostile to the idea of any nationalist having any role in supervising the administration of justice and possibly overseeing the police. By and large, the parties have accepted a settlement whereby the Minister of Justice is voted for by cross-community consent. And the hidden secret of that is that the candidate is almost invariably from the Alliance Party. So we have the odd feature of Northern Ireland's power sharing arrangements that we can have a First Minister who is a nationalist, but so far there has never been a nationalist Minister of Justice. So those are the 3 components of the power sharing executive. Happy to take further questions.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I think that sort of gives a very quick overview of how some of those institutions work. So moving into thinking about some of those election results, we can maybe start with sort of the big news, which is that again, with 27 seats, Sinn Féin is now the largest party in the Assembly, and again can nominate for that First Minister post. And I'm wondering if you'd both like to sort of speak to the significance of this outcome, both sort of in a historical context, as well as sort of looking forward. And so by this, I mean both sort of the symbolic value or impact of a potential nationalist first minister and a unionist deputy first minister, as well as perhaps at a practical level, what it suggests for how the institutions might run. So in many ways, the election has been described as both one where everything changes and one where nothing has changed. And I'm wondering which of those two statements you think applies. So Brendan, maybe I'll come to you first. So in a co-authored piece published earlier this week, you described the election results as much more than meh. In what ways are the results transformational, and in what ways perhaps are we seeing just more of the same?
First of all, it's not merely symbolic that Sinn Féin came in first place. It's a very important signal of possible changes to come. Jointly, all kinds of nationalist party, provided one defines people before profit as de facto a nationalist party, came ahead of unionist parties in first preference votes. If, however, you code the independents who ran separately, then overall unionists retain a narrow plurality in first preference votes. So one way of summarizing this is unionist hegemony is decisively over. Unionist plurality hangs by a thread. If there is no election for another 5 years, a moot point at the moment, I think this will be the last occasion in which there is a unionist plurality. So it's a moment that marks the final inflection point for unionism. And it's quite significant. 100 years ago, the place was established as a result of the Northern Ireland Parliament opting out or seceding from the Irish Free State. So its 100th birthday coincides with the demographic loss of the majority by Ulster Protestants and the electoral loss of a majority by Ulster Unionists, and the possibility that they will soon lose their plurality. The SDLP did badly among the nationalist bloc. So the combined seat share of nationalists is less than the combined seat share of unionists. But the most significant thing on the unionist side was the scale of fragmentation. The traditional unionist voice opposed to the protocol, it had no C border written on its ballot papers, did rather well. It got about 7% of the vote. It only won one seat, but almost all of its transfers went to the Democratic Unionist Party. And that meant that even though the party had done poorly by comparative standards in its first preference vote, it only lost 3 seats by comparison with 2017. So the DUP certainly received a shock. And it seems implausible, for the reason given earlier, a very slightly growing nationalist bloc and demographic change, that the DUP will ever win first place again. For that to happen, it needs to get all those TUV votes back again and to have another election fairly soon. If we look at the others, I think the most significant thing about the others is they did not do as well as predicted in opinion polls. There was an absurd survey done by the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey finding 28% of people identified with Alliance. They didn't get anything like that. They got 13.5% of the vote. Altogether, others got 16.4% of the first preference vote. But because they're transfer friendly, they did relatively well in seats. It's important that Alliance has consolidated itself as the dominant party among the others. This took place at the expense of the Greens, who lost their remaining seats. So crudely, very crudely, we have a 40-40-20 world in seats, and we have a 42-41, 16-17% world in terms of the first preference vote. Not enough, I think, of a surge among the others to spell necessary requests for significant institutional change. Those requests will be made, but I don't think on the election results alone that they would be warranted. We can come to the question of the protocol perhaps later, but that was the DUP's claim throughout. It would not allow an executive to form unless the British government either scrapped the protocol or radically modified. It wasn't clear which. Now, that is a stunning phenomenon because you have to remember the amount of chutzpah involved. A small minority party in a small regional assembly inside one state, the United Kingdom, wanting in effect the UK to have a trade war with the United Kingdom at a time when the bulk of NATO and the European Union are in full solidarity with Ukraine against Russia. It's quite a remarkable moment of that bears resemblance to Winston Churchill's famous remarks about the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone emerging from the soil after World War I.
It's certainly a useful sort of point of sort of just to bring it sort of into wider view there. Thank you, Brendan. Claire, what do you think? More of the same, or has everything changed?
I would tend to agree with Brendan in that not everything has changed. Yes, there are slightly different dynamics at play, but by and large, we still have the same institutional framework. We still have the same obligations there in terms of the focus on unionist and nationalist blocs within the institutions. So in that regard, very little has changed. But I think I differ slightly with regards to my outlook on the others, and particularly the Alliance Party within the spectrum. Their success that they have seen and their growth, that alliance surge that you referred to earlier, that very much came to the fore in the 2019 series of elections we had. We had them at all levels in 2019 here, and that was where we first started to see this centre ground emergence. And the big question was whether or not what we were seeing at those other levels, so the Council, Westminster, European Parliament, whether that would translate into an assembly election where we know, because of the way in which things are designed, that there's an incentive for the electorate to direct their votes towards the unionist and nationalist blocs. So I think it is much more significant than, not as significant as some media outlets will portray at the moment, but certainly it is significant insofar as actually we have seen that pattern continue into the assembly. We now see, yes, it isn't big enough yet to rival the unionist or nationalist blocs, but it is certainly bigger, and it is the biggest that it has been. And I think there is a wider question mark there that I think we've started to tap into a little bit as to whether or not it is actually the so-called other designate group that needs to be the source of focus here, or is it the Alliance Party in and of itself, considering that it has gained its success at the expense of the Green Party, largely benefiting from being transfer friendly across the political spectrum. So it drew votes both from the nationalist side of things and from the unionist side of things. So there's a whole lot of potential questions to be dissected with regard to that. And I think as well, just to reflect on what happened within unionism, we knew going into the election that was always going to be a very interesting area to watch, purely by the sheer number of parties that voters had the option to choose from there. And I think in particular, I think Brendan mentioned this as well about transfer friendliness with regard to the TUV, and even opinion pollings leading up to the election reflected what ultimately came to pass in the election, insofar as the TUV really struggled. They had 7.5% of first preference votes, but got one seat at the end of it all. That's largely because they weren't transfer friendly. DUP supporters were more inclined to vote first preference for TUV than they were to direct lower preferences to the TUV, and that's what scuppered them in the end. Whereas for TUV voters, they were willing to transfer votes to the DUP, and it was those transfers from TUV and also from Ulster Unionist Party that ultimately got the DUP over the line in as many constituencies and for as many seats as they did. Without that, I think there's a general consensus that they would have struggled a lot more to uphold the seats that they had after the 2017 election. So there's a lot of dynamics there. It was a much simpler picture within nationalism, as Brendan has touched upon. You had Sinn Féin, you had the SDLP. Probably the biggest battle, if I can put it that way, that was going on there was around the narratives and the dynamics of the First Minister, this nationalist First Minister. that was something that Sinn Féin really started to push in those last couple of weeks of the election. It's been described in some quarters that they ran quite a presidential style campaign, really putting Michelle O'Neill, who's the leader of the party in Northern Ireland, at the forefront of things. We saw her going to the gym and, videos of her at home drinking tea and all of that, trying to get to know the person as opposed to putting the party necessarily to the forefront. And quite strangely, to an extent, the party played down the constitutional question in this election campaign as well, which seems baffling, but it was something that didn't need to be on the agenda, because essentially all the parties bar the DUP just had to sit quietly, not put a foot out of line, and just get to the finish line. So there's a lot of interesting dynamics going on there. So not really an answer to your question, is it the same or is it different? There's a bit of both sides going on, but I think we're broadly, it is much the same, particularly if you look at the challenges that we're going into now.
Sure, thank you. And Brendan, I think you wanted to come in on this as well?
It's a question of emphasis. Alliance didn't do as well as the polls predicted in terms of first preference vote. Its first preference vote was lower than its first outing in 1973 in local government elections, when it got 14% of the vote. The argument of Alliance has always been, as Clare puts it, that somehow the designation rules disadvantage the others and thereby give the voters an incentive to vote nationalist or unionist. I disagree. The STV system actually benefits Alliance, and this is a demonstrable case of that. And the arrangements around the Justice Minister mean that there is always an extra seat in the cabinet for the others. So Alliance are actually overrepresented in the cabinet as a byproduct of that feature. Yes, the others have done well, but they did not do as well as they did in 2019 in either the European elections or the Westminster elections. So I'm just asking for a more measured tone on assessing how they did. I'm not saying they did badly in relationship to previous performances, but they didn't do enough to make a compelling argument for institutional change.
Absolutely. Yeah, Clare.
Yeah. No, just to pick up, I think it's worth, I agree with what Brendan has said there entirely. And I think it's worth reflecting as well. In 2019, there were wider political dynamics, particularly underpinned by Brexit and the wider issues going on around what that post-Brexit situation or arrangement would be for Northern Ireland, that arguably contributed to some of the voting patterns that we saw in all of those elections that we had during that period of time. So I think it's just worth emphasising that was part of the picture then. And it's something I should have highlighted as well, that kind of fed into that question mark as to whether or not it could translate into this Assembly election coming a few years down the road. So just wanted to add that in there. So.
One further comment on, Clare correctly described the Sinn Féin campaign. What's interesting to me is that Colm Eastwood, by everybody's consensus, decisively won the 2 television debates. That was clear in public opinion afterwards. It was clear in commentators' reactions. So the question is, do those TV debates make no impact? They should have done if the campaign was decided by presidential style qualities. It's quite possible that Eastwood saved the SDLP from an even further worse performance by having such an effective performance in the 2 debates. So the SDLP's position is quite precarious. I don't think it won extra votes as a result of the first ministership being at stake, because that was already the case in 2017 when they did remarkably well. So that's already baked in. What they got was just a little further marginal gain at the expense of the SDLP, in my view.
Right. Yeah, I think if I recall, it's about 1.1% of the vote more this time around, yeah. Right, for Sinn Féin. Sort of to come to maybe, as Clare talked about, sort of the constitutional question wasn't front and center perhaps during the campaign, but I'm wondering if we could maybe turn to thinking about what this might mean for Irish unity debates, given Sinn Féin's support for Irish unity. Audience members were able to, when they registered, give us a few questions. So there's a few that relate to this question. So I'll just read these out now, and then we can perhaps take them in turn. So one of the questions argues that the past continues to block the future in Northern Ireland. Would it make sense to set a border poll date, and they list here 2035, and let the devolved government get on with policy in the meantime? And another question, is unification between North and South inevitable? And if yes, should it be done sooner rather than later? So I'm wondering if you both might want to speak to what the outcome means for unity debates and what conditions might need to be in place for this to happen, and do the results sort of expedite matter. So maybe Claire, I'll start with you and then I'll come to Brendan.
Sure. If there's one thing I've learned in being from Northern Ireland and studying it, is to always expect the unexpected. So I'm reluctant to pin anything down in terms of dates or the likelihood of outcomes of a border poll. I think the general consensus here, at least, is that there will be a border poll at some point in the not too distant future. Probably at a much quicker or sooner point in time than would have been the case had Brexit not happened. It's generally accepted that it has been somewhat of a catalyst in terms of conversations to that end. If it was the case that a border poll date was to be set, so for example, I think it's the first question there, if we're to say, we're going to have one in 2025 for talk's sake, and that's it. The difficulty with that is it wouldn't actually clarify anything or make things easier, to my view at least. I think notwithstanding obviously the current political challenges and issues that we have, but if it was the case there was a date set, that would pretty much assert so much of the focus and the energies in the political sphere that effectively it would be like the Brexit referendum. It would be, to an extent, like we saw with this election. All focus would be on that, as opposed to the day-to-day policy, the boring stuff of politics, if I can put it that way. So in some senses, it's better to not have it there. And I think there's a general consensus across nationalism and the nationalist parties as well, that actually, even if a date was set, a hard and fast date at this point in time, it probably wouldn't be advantageous to the Irish reunification cause, because in their view, there's still so much work to be done around teasing out the practicalities of, well, what would a reunified Ireland look like economically, socially, politically, and so forth. So I'm not sure that there will be a benefit in setting a hard and fast date at this point anyway. And on the question of is unification inevitable, I really don't know is the short answer to that. Does anybody know? But I think if you look at some of the recent polling that has been done, there was one recently by my colleagues at the University of Liverpool. They did a poll which found that if a border poll was to be called in the morning, and this was around March time, the question was asked, would you vote for Irish reunification? And only something like 30% of people said that they would. And when that was extrapolated and the question asked, in 10 to 15 years, would you change your mind on this? Only 3 to 4% of people further to that said that they would. So I've spoken previously in terms of the Irish reunification question, indeed, whatever perspective on Ireland's constitutional future, it being a matter of head versus heart. And ultimately, I'm not sure which one would win out. In the event of a border poll, it'll be the wider political circumstances ultimately that will dictate things. But you might be able to look at polls that'll say, well, we have X number of people who identify as nationalist or Catholic or Irish, or whichever way you wish to think about it, and sort of categorize identity. But you can't guarantee that that will actually translate to a vote one way or the other. And the final point that I'll add in just within this wider conversation is that there isn't a set of fixed criteria by which the Secretary of State, who's tasked with calling a border poll, can actually say these criteria have been met, let's go. It's very much at their discretion as to when they feel the conditions are right for a border poll to happen. So there's a whole political dynamic at the national level, at the UK level, that feeds into that broader picture as well. So I'll leave it there.
Perfect. Thank you, Claire. Brendan.
So first of all, in answer to the question, it would be undesirable to set a referendum date in 2035. To have a permanent campaign over 13 years would be little short of insanity. The Secretary of State, at some juncture, when there is reasonable evidence to change the Secretary of State's mind, should called a border poll. In my view, that is most likely to start happening around 2030. And the reason I take that view is not because I think demography is destiny, but nevertheless, it will be the case in 2030 that in every age cohort, except possibly the over 85s, there will be a non-Protestant majority. So at that juncture, unless there's massive emigration or massive immigration into Northern Ireland between 2011 and now that we haven't noticed, and some massive migratory change in the future, the fate of Northern Ireland will be in the hands of non-Protestants for the first time. No, Irish reunification is not inevitable, but it is plausible and possible in ways that were not true before. It's plausible because, first of all, the Republic of Ireland is a dramatic institutional and economic success. That can't be said of Northern Ireland, nor can it be said any longer of the United Kingdom, which is an institutional mess as a consequence of Brexit. Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland today are both richer per head than West Germany and East Germany were, respectively, in 1990. Most of the economic arguments about the difficulties of Irish reunification are either exaggerated or outdated. The deep differences remain questions of national and political identity. And the supposition of many, not least those who advertise their wares in Liverpool, is that the others are non-nationalist and non-unionist. In fact, if you look at their preferences when obliged to choose, they split three ways. They're pro-union, pro-unification, or they don't know. And that would be my answer to the question. The referendum will be decided by the don't knows, those who are weakly aligned with one bloc or the other, and mostly would represent the formal others. And they will matter, and they will be shaped by the dynamics of changing demography, particularly the dynamic among the young, and they'll be changed by the transformed picture of the Republic. Now, whether in the remaining years before 2030, Great Britain can improve its institutional and economic performance compared to the Republic of Ireland, who knows? It certainly doesn't look that way, to my mind, right now.
Thank you. So as we've talked about a little bit already here, the role of the alliance, and again, what some have called a surge, certainly it has done better than it has previously. So with 17 seats, a net increase of 9. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that other designation, both in terms of what alliances results mean for others. Again, as noted, the Green Party has lost its 2 seats. So the alliance success has sort of squeezed out some of the others. But sort of broadly what it means for sort of the context of power sharing. So is this a sign of moving away from orange versus green politics? Are we seeing a rise of civic solidarity as people like Sierra Murtaugh argue, or again, is it something else? And then again, maybe we can link that to sort of some of that census data perhaps as well. Again, the don't knows, or as Katie Hayward calls them, the neither nors. We do have census results coming up, and how might that impact political dynamics? So maybe again, just a little bit more about what role for others and how we situate alliance in that space. And maybe Brendan, again, sort of to sort of maybe rein us back a little bit on this.
First of all, let's start with an important fact. Roughly 83 to 84% of people voted for formally nationalist or formally unionist parties. Despite efforts to focus on so-called bread and butter questions, the cost of living crisis and so on, it remains the case that over 8 in 10 voters voted largely according to nationalist or unionist bloc allegiances. Now, I'm not suggesting for one moment that the national question animates their daily lives in a thoroughgoing way. It just means when tested in elections, that's how they vote. The proportion of those voting other has gone up, but not all of the others are non-nationalist or non-unionist. The Greens are an all-island party. They don't emphasize Irish reunification, but they're certainly not opposed to it. Even the alliance position cannot be interpreted as anti-unification. There's a tendency to code alliance voting as pro-unionist, but the party made a decision some time ago to be neutral on the union. And I would submit if it wasn't neutral on the union, its support would be much lower. Sociologically, what I suspect has happened is a significant number of cultural Catholics, people from cultural Catholic backgrounds, who were not enthusiastic about Sinn Féin, didn't go with the SDLP because the SDLP remained with a more traditional and rigid Catholicism domestically on questions of social liberalism. So the Alliance Party attracted young, socially liberal cultural Catholics, and did so as well among socially liberal cultural Protestants. It wasn't confined to the SDLP. So they gained some from both the SDLP and from the Ulster Unionist Party in that fashion. But it's a party that once the question is posed, wouldn't hold together. It would have to make a decision both to let its MLAs and its voters make their own minds up. Excuse me, because it's a party which basically says, let's not talk about this, let's talk about what we have in common. Now, that has many merits, and I'm certainly not arguing for their exclusion from democratic participation. What I am suggesting is that we should focus on feasible reforms to the power sharing institutions. And one of those would be to modify the way in which the first ministers are currently elected. And that would, in my view, be best accomplished by electing the entirety of the executive through the D'Hondt rule. And that would mean each party's support would be reflected in the composition of the executive, and there wouldn't be a privileged position for the dominant nationalist or dominant unionist party. That would be step one. The second thing is, whether it is in the hands of a nationalist or in the hands of the unionist, the power of one party leader who does not enjoy majority support in the assembly, either to prevent government formation or to force an election, should be looked at. If you like, the problem with the dual premiership is that it looks too much like a modified UK premiership. In many countries, the electoral term of an assembly is fixed, and a prime minister, or in this case, two prime ministers, does not have the right to precipitate an early election or to block government formation. I think that change would be sufficient to ensure a generous share for the Alliance Party. It could mean that you could get rid of the unionist veto on any nationalist becoming a justice minister. You'd get a proportional outcome, and you wouldn't have this overweening ability of a party, whether it be Sinn Féin or the DUP or any other party, blocking government formation. There was a constitutional question discussed in the election. The constitutional question was the protocol. The protocol is attached to the UK. It's an integral part of the UK's withdrawal treaty with the European Union. The protocol is a fundamental matter of international law intended to protect the Good Friday Agreement. And there, I think the results are unambiguous. The anti-protocol parties, those who wanted it scrapped or radically modified, got significantly less support than those parties that favored a functional protocol, none of whom were saying it's absolutely perfect in each respect, but we're quite willing to work with it. Now, what we have is a remarkable moment in which the Conservatives are currently contemplating, so they say, legislation to rescind or unilaterally amend the treaty. And yet the Conservatives had carefully, with the EU, negotiated an opportunity for the Northern Ireland Assembly to vote on the protocol, in effect in 2024. So having seen these election outcomes, it would, in my view, be constitutionally outrageous to preempt the decision of the Assembly by precipitating a unilateral change in the treaty with the with the EU. There's no local warrant for that. Most of the constitutional arguments are rubbish, in particular the claim that the protocol violates the Good Friday Agreement. It violates neither the principle of consent, nor does it violate the principle of cross-community consent for decisions that are devolved, because the functions that are attached to the protocol are not devolved functions. So the arguments are a tissue of exaggeration and lies, and regrettably, they're taken too seriously by too many commentators.
Thanks, Brendan. And we'll come back to the Northern Ireland Protocol as well in a few moments. I just want to turn to Clare to talk a little bit about the others and whether or not, again, is this now time for, we have a few questions that have come in that have been pre-submitted. Is now the time to reform to allow non-aligned parties to have more say in the Assembly and in the Executive? Should the provisions for cross-community consent based on parties registering according to community designations be changed? If so, to what? So maybe just speaking about what are the prospects for some constitutional changes or reforms on how others are represented both in the Assembly and in the Executive? Maybe Clare, if you want to speak to that.
So yeah, I agree with Brendan that there isn't enough there in terms of that other block that immediately everyone's mind should be turning to, right, we need to reform things straight away. But I do think that there is sufficient change there, and indeed the conversation, the wider conversation around governance in Northern Ireland is at a point where it's mature enough. I think I said that with no executive on the horizon, but I think we're at a stage politically where there's a sense of maturity there to think about the future and to think about the steps towards institutional reform in various guises. Now, the Good Friday Agreement and the arrangements that set out how the institutions would be arranged have been altered, they've been tweaked in terms of their operations through a number of different agreements in the interim years. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that other changes could be achieved. But the question is, where do you focus those changes? Because if you change one aspect, so you've mentioned there around designations, for example, if you change that, then it's not just something that happens in isolation. There's a whole knock-on effect in terms of how the institutions operate and function that links back to a much more fundamental question around what is it that we need these institutions to be doing. So I think we're at a point where it's appropriate to be having the conversations for definite. I think the fact that it has moved from being an abstract idea that others and non-nationalists and non-unionists could potentially be in a growing group or a rival third block within the institutions. So I think there's space for that conversation to be happening now in real terms, as opposed to academics sitting together in rooms talking about these things in hypothetical terms. There's an actual real tangible I guess picture there now that the wider public is able to tap into in a way that simply wasn't really there as an option before. So there's definitely conversations to be had around that. And I think certainly with Alliance Party in particular and at the forefront of the other designation now as they are, and the attention that they've been receiving, warranted or otherwise through social media and commentaries and so forth, that not only will the conversation situate around what will need to happen in the future, potentially, how could things change, but I think it has helped create awareness of actually how they function now in the present. And the anomaly around First and Deputy First Minister is something that Alliance have been banging a drum about for 10, 15 years, if not more. And it's only now that it's starting to gain a little bit of traction. So I think, yes, we're at a point where there's space for that conversation to be happening about how the institutions need to develop, how they should develop. But I'm not convinced or confident or in any way trying to say that we're at a stage where this is something that's going to happen overnight, or indeed that it should happen overnight. I think there's still a lot there to be sifted out. And to go back to that question, have we moved away from the green and orange politics? Absolutely not. Not only did the election results show that, but the institutions currently as they're designed wouldn't facilitate that. So all of these things need to be happening in parallel to each other, all of these conversations. But yeah, I do think we're at a quite a significant point in Northern Ireland's institutional development in terms of thinking about what needs to come next. And if there's one thing to take from that election, it's that more concerted focus on the next steps as opposed to necessarily always what came from the past, if that makes sense.
Right. Thanks, Claire. Brendan.
Two comments that don't disagree directly with what Claire has just said. First of all, if the agreement and its institutions are to be modified, then the method of modification is clear. There has to be a consensus among the domestic parties in Northern Ireland and the two sovereign governments. That's the way changes are made. If we get unilateral changes by Westminster, that would be, in my view, deeply destabilizing, especially if they were seen to be partisan on behalf of the DUP or any unionist party. So change, by all means, if there is agreement. It doesn't mean that what the parties will agree will be sensible. John McGarry and I, for example, disagreed with the proposed changes to the election of the premiers at St Andrews. We would have preferred the simple use of the D'Hondt rule, which would have avoided the alliance question completely and been fair to them. So that's comment number one. The second is an historical comment. We should not forget that there have been others throughout the history of Northern Ireland. It's not some novel phenomenon. There's always been a third block defined by not being in the other two blocks, and its size has fluctuated between roughly 10% and 15%. And what we now have is it's at 16%. So it's not I want to emphasize, it's not as dynamically transformative as people, particularly if they're young, might like to think.
On the question of others, there is a question in the chat that's happening now about the classification of different parties. And I know, Brendan, again, in the article this week, how you classify some of the different parties, like People Before Profits, some of the other smaller socialist parties. Maybe you want to speak to
Yes.
Which parties are others and which parties are nationalists or unionists.
Right. There are two ways of thinking about parties in Northern Ireland. One is the designations they choose for themselves in the Northern Ireland Assembly. According to the existing legislation, a party and its individual members must align either as nationalist, unionist, or other. And that then sets the basis for voting rules. Much of what the Assembly does proceeds under normal majority rule, but certain specific decisions require cross-community consent, which can be expressed in two forms, either a concurrent majority of registered nationalists and unionists and a majority overall, or a weighted majority, 40% of unionists, 40% of nationalists, and a majority of 60% overall. To trigger these cross-community consent procedures, a petition of concern may be addressed to the Assembly by 30 members. So at the moment, no single party has the ability to trigger that process on any subject they like. So that's designation. And if we look at the composition of the Assembly at the moment, it's 20 others, it's 37 unionists and 35 nationalists. The other way to look at parties is what's their position on the national question. Do they favor Irish reunification, or do they favor the maintaining of the union? Or thirdly, are they neutral, indifferent, would rather talk about something else in relationship to the national question? And if you split all the parties that way, then you get a split of roughly 41, 41, 18 among the parties. So there's a slight difference, but not much. The big difference is accounted for by People Before Profit, which my colleagues and I code as a nationalist party, even though it would, in the Assembly, define itself as other. And that's because part of its manifesto explicitly calls for a border poll. It seeks Irish reunification, and it largely also, this is additional evidence, but immaterial, it competes primarily as a left-wing alternative to Sinn Féin in Belfast and Derry. The other candidates, if you code them, what you have to do is to look to see what their dispositions are online, what do they emphasize. And most of the independents turn out to be other, with very small proportions of votes, but there's a small number of independent unionists and independent nationalists who clearly align as nationalist or unionist, and it's easy to code them. Is that the question?
Yes, that was perfect. Thank you. Claire, I know you've done a lot of work on others as well. Did you want to talk about how we decide how to classify parties?
Yeah, there's not much more really to add to what Brenton has already said there, but yeah, it is an interesting anomaly where the institutions demand that you classify as into one of those three blocks, the unionist, nationalist, or other. I know people before profit, they whenever they're signing the register, they don't actually write other. They put down, I think it's something along the Socialist Party description, basically.
And they also put Republican.
That's, yeah, exactly. So it's kind of, you can put something else, but you'll automatically be classified as other by the powers that be within the institutions themselves. So yeah, I guess really there's that kind of anomaly, and again, if you're thinking about how that might translate into conversations around the constitutional future, it again emphasizes that yes, you might have one set of expectations based on what you see within the institutions, be that at the assembly level or in Westminster or even at the council level, but that doesn't necessarily reflect how people describe themselves in terms of their constitutional position should a border poll come around. And indeed, it doesn't give a direct indication as to how, even if a person describes themselves one way, how they would actually vote in such a situation. So yeah, we can deduce lots of information, but it might ultimately lead us down the wrong paths very easily. So a lot of moving parts with all of this.
One last thing, I think it's important to remember that the designation rules were mutually agreed as insurance against the possibility that one bloc or the other might tyrannize over the other. Now, we haven't seen that recently. We've certainly seen vetoes to changes preferred by one group or the other, but we haven't seen majority tyranny. So the designation rules were agreed to prevent that possibility, and therefore their removal should be done, if at all, delicately, to ensure that no group sees its future as one of perpetual loss. The same cannot be done with regard to the referendum. One side will lose in the referendum. Therefore, it will be incumbent on the Irish government, if unification is the winning option, to prepare an institutional and other sets of soft landings for those who lose. And likewise, for the pro-union side, they need to think about how they reconcile disappointed nationalists in the event of a defeat on the referendum question in future.
So on that question, there's a few comments happening in the chat related to the conditions for a border poll, noting that how the referendum unfolded on Brexit and needing to sort of take care in how that process is designed. Would either of you like to sort of speak to what conditions might need to be in place for that poll, or how it should be run, and voting rights and
do you mind if I go first, Claire?
No, far away.
So I worked with other colleagues on this in the working group on reunification referendums led by University College London. And the group agreed. The group was a mixture of independent scholars, some who would be identified with soft nationalist positions, and one or two unionists. And we all agreed that it was vital that nothing like the Brexit referendum would be ideal. Now, if you want to characterize the Brexit referendum, it was one in which there was a choice between the status quo and an undefined alternative. It wasn't clear what leave meant. Leave was allowed to mean everything. And that was partly the result of Cameron's own decision. He wanted to polarize the choice between safety first, the UK, and chaos. Well, chaos won, and chaos then meant that there was a constant debate about what the meaning of the referendum was. So most of us attached to this working referendum group agree that in a properly prepared referendum, it would be clear what the question was, and it would be clear what voting for United Ireland would mean. And that would mean decisions would have to be made in advance. Did it mean the dissolution of Northern Ireland? Did it mean the retention of a devolved Northern Ireland inside a United Ireland? What would be the arrangements on the economy, on policing, on social services, on the health service, and so on? All of these things can be done. We saw in the Scottish referendum that the Scottish National Party developed, I believe it was a 670-page treatise on what would happen in an independent Scotland. My personal view is something like that must be prepared over the next decade by a Ministry of Unification in the Republic, because unification would have momentous consequences for the Republic, and all those things should be clear in advance. Broadly speaking, there's a debate between two positions. One is that the Republic should make clear what the model of reunification will be in the event of a vote. It'll be a unitary integrated republic with Northern Ireland disappearing. That's one option. Another might be a devolved Northern Ireland inside a United Ireland. Others still might think about federation and so on. So the first position is the South presents a model on which both vote. The second position, which would be favored by those who love Jürgen Habermas and abstract ideals of democracy, would be you vote on the principle, and then you create a constitutional convention which designs the institutional arrangements of United Ireland. Now, that might sound the most reasonable and democratic thing to do. The problem with it is that it puts everything into a high level of uncertainty. You don't know what you're voting for. You don't even know if there will be an outcome to the Constitutional Convention, which could turn down all proposals put before it, or indeed, the public could then vote down the proposals reached in the Constitutional Convention, in which case the default would have to be the existing Irish Constitution. So when you explore that road, it looks much more plausible that the calmer route to a clear outcome is for the South to offer a determinate model of what would happen in the event of reunification. A last word. What does the Secretary of State have to do? Clare referred to a lot of discretion. I agree there's a lot of discretion, but it's not absolute. So a Secretary of State who triggers a referendum when there isn't objective evidence of a shift, and I would define that objective evidence either as surveys or a consistent set of well-conducted polls, or a consistent set of election results, or a majority resolution of the Northern Ireland Assembly, or indeed a majority resolution of Northern Ireland's MPs at Westminster, even if they're not all attending. All of those are possible objective indicators of a wish for change. If they weren't there, if the Conservatives wanted to hold a referendum early in the hope of catching Sinn Féin or the SDLP off guard, that might be stopped in the courts, because the Secretary of State would have to justify why he or she had decided to call a referendum. So the Secretary of State's ability to hold a referendum is partially constrained by law. They must conduct their office properly, and they must show some material evidence that led them to change their minds. So it isn't quite as arbitrary as people think. The other difficulty is easily described. Why did the Irish government leave it to a British Secretary of State to decide when a referendum would be called? The complex answer to that question is simple. The UK has this system of parliamentary sovereignty. If UK sovereignty over Northern Ireland was to be clear, Ireland could have no role formally in triggering a referendum. That's why the decision is vested in the Secretary of State. Now, everybody knows that behind the legal figure of the Secretary of State rests the British Cabinet. the Secretary of State is unlikely to do something without the support of the British cabinet. And only an incompetent or malevolent British government would seek to plan a referendum without consulting its nearest sovereign neighbor. At the moment, we have to be worried that there is a government in power that might not do something like that. But in general, that was the thinking of those who did the designing in 1998.
Thanks, Brendan. Claire, do you want to weigh in on this question of the conditions for a border poll?
Sure. Yeah, I think we've touched on earlier about it being the so-called don't knows that would ultimately, well, as things stand, it looks like they would be the deciding group in a border poll. And picking up on the work that Brendan was referencing there, very much, if you've got people who don't know what way they lean in constitutional terms, if they prefer Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom or as part of reunified Ireland, then it's going to be the facts that are in front of them at the time of the border poll that will make the decision for them. So they'll be driven largely by what their head is telling them as opposed to what their heart is telling them in terms of what they would like to see. So it's imperative. I don't think it can be overstated, the importance of the lessons that we've learned from the Brexit experience and the need that there is for clarity, both in terms of what Northern Ireland would look like as part of a reunified Ireland and as part of the United Kingdom in the aftermath of a border poll. And if it is the case at any point in the future that there's a particularly spontaneous Secretary of State or whatever the situation is that leads to a border poll being called, where those pieces of the puzzle haven't been laid out in advance, then even if it is challenged in the courts, as I imagine and agree with Brendan, it probably would be in such a case if it looked like there wasn't actually the support there for that, then even just the act of trying to trigger the border poll at a point in time could be enough to be deeply unstabilizing or destabilizing parties to what's going on in Northern Ireland politically. And indeed, those ongoing conversations that we have seen, particularly in the wake of Brexit, not exclusively since Brexit, but the way that they have progressed since 2016, both in terms of what's happening on the island of Ireland and indeed Northern Ireland's place as part of the United Kingdom, they would be deeply disrupted by such a movement as well. And we could see that it would actually end up worsening relations across both islands as opposed to being anything that could be potentially at worst case scenario an opportunity or an exercise to learn from. It could actually end up being a deeply destabilizing experiment, for want of a better word, if something like that were to happen.
Absolutely. Thanks, Claire. And it certainly, I mean, much of this has sort of been expedited by Brexit. And again, a third major story of the election has been in relation to Brexit and the Northern Ireland Protocol in particular. So parties that support or are willing to tolerate the protocol hold a majority of the assembly seats. And as we have seen this week, the DUP have been again, not only vocally opposed, but again, threatening to boycott Stormont as a result. So Sir Geoffrey Donaldson has said, quote, "We will not nominate ministers until there is decisive action taken by the UK government on the protocol." And so first, I'm wondering what decisive action, if any, is needed to the protocol? How likely is that to happen? And there was a question earlier in the chat, sort of, let me see if I can just find it here, that basically isn't the DUP between a rock and a hard place? If it continues to refuse to enter the executive, will likely lead to elections again in 6 months' time. Will that just sort of create more of the same again? So, so wondering, again, speaking to,
it's a very good question. The DUP was lucky this time. It lost a lot of first preference votes. It recovered nearly all of the seats it was going to lose thanks to TUV transfers. If it triggers another election, it can't be guaranteed that it will do as well. And only one party in the north at the moment is sufficiently well resourced and with sufficient personnel to contemplate another election easily, and that would be Sinn Féin. So point number one, the DUP is worried. You're correct to highlight that phrase, decisive action. It's not the same as scrapping. It's not the same as radically modifying. It's whatever fig leaf Jeffrey Donaldson thinks he needs to go into the executive or to nominate a deputy first minister to serve. We don't know that. We don't know if Boris Johnson and Liz Truss are cunning enough to come up with some tiny change that will look like a unilateral change, but will be such a modest, tiny mouse that the EU might decide to ignore it. And that would be decisive action. But the problem with that is, the TUV is not made up of fools. They may be reactionaries. They may object to everything that's happened since 1972, let alone 1998. But they're not fools. Alistair is a lawyer. He will know if a decisive change has not been made or not. So it'll be difficult for the DUP. I think the more material question at present is Northern Ireland being held hostage to the current wish of the incumbent Prime Minister to stay in office and to the ambition of his Foreign Secretary to succeed him? Because if we had somebody holding office who wasn't running for the Premiership or in the Premiership and worried about it, I think this would be a very clear situation in which the British government would simply tell the DUP to go ahead and go into government, and they're not getting a significant change on the protocol, though they'll continue to talk to the EU.
Thanks, Brendan. Clare?
Yeah, I completely agree. This situation that we're in at the moment is very much everything that's hinging politically in Northern Ireland at the moment is resting in Boris Johnson's hands. And it's domestically convenient for him at this point to ramp up the tensions with the European Union. He's faced his own bashing at the ballot box with the local council elections that were held there last week on the same day as the Assembly elections. He is facing a lot of flack within his own party, particularly with regard to the protocol, and a lot of pressure that he should have taken more decisive action before now. So he's treading a line where, on the one hand, he's wanting to somewhat appease the DUP insofar as saying, do you know what, we're going to ramp up these tensions. But at the same time, he's not being clear in exactly what it is even that he fully wants to achieve. I'm certainly not clear what he sees as being a sufficient gain insofar as what it might be to get the DUP back in the executive, or indeed those conversations with the EU. I can't understand what it is he thinks the Prime Minister is going to achieve by ramping up the tensions with the European Union in the way that is being done. So I think we're in an extremely difficult situation politically in Northern Ireland, where we're looking to the Prime Minister to give that nod, to give that direction, or just to give something that will act at least as an encouragement, or just something that the DUP is able to sell to its voter base, or that it's able to sell itself, full stop, where it can say, look, we achieved this, that'll do for now, we'll get back around the table. And that's not happening. So the one person who should be at the centre of all of this at the moment is Boris Johnson. It's the Prime Minister, and he's the most absent presence in every which direction of the issues at the moment. But yeah, I think if we're looking at what the DUP needs to achieve, what that crossing point will be, if it's the case that Westminster or Boris Johnson could turn around and say, do you know what, we'll give you X and we'll keep working on A, B and C, would that be enough for the DUP? I don't know. The DUP have this list of 7 criteria that they want any changes to the protocol to meet. Will it be the case that they will very rigidly stick to those 7 criteria before getting back in? Or will it be the case that if they can see that there's some movement, might that just be enough? I'm really not sure. But the one thing that I am relatively confident about is that the DUP is very acutely aware of the issues that are facing people in Northern Ireland presently. They've been out campaigning every bit as much as the other parties in the last few weeks in the lead up to the election. They know that they need to be back around the table, because if it is the case that there's another election, and indeed at some point they're going to be going back to the polls and asking people for their vote, they're not going to be preparing very well if they're the reason that people's issues currently have been continued. And I think it's worth highlighting as well, just to reference one of the earlier points that Brendan made in his response to this, about the DUP being almost afraid, or have reason to be afraid of the electorate. if we look at what's happened with Jeffrey Donaldson, Sir Jeffrey Donaldson, who's the leader of the party, he was elected to the Assembly last week. He's currently an MP, and he announced the other day that he will stay in Westminster. He won't take up the seat that he has just been elected to. And the reason for that, he said his explanation for that was that he feels essentially he can affect more change with regard to the protocol with him being in Westminster than in Stormont. But if you look at what's happening within his constituency in Lagan Valley, it's the pressure of what would inevitably be a very close by-election with the Alliance Party. And there's a fear there that he could ultimately actually end up losing his seat in the DUP for obvious reasons, can't risk that. So yeah, a long and short answer is we're at the mercy of Boris Johnson and what's going on at that high level between the UK and EU to fix what's happening at the local level here in Northern Ireland.
I'd like also to just reiterate in a different way the chutzpah here. 27 members of the EU are in complete solidarity with the commissioner tasked with negotiating how the protocol is implemented. It's going to be extremely difficult for them to change. The US Congress wants the Good Friday Agreement to be protected, and they see the protocol as a mechanism through which the Good Friday Agreement is protected. If you damage the Good Friday Agreement, the message is to the United Kingdom, you don't get a trade deal in the United States. You are considered the prime cause of a loss of favorable alignment between the EU and the UK on security questions. So don't do it, is what they're being told. So we'll see whether this is just a brief moment of a week in politics in which the Prime Minister tries to rally his base and then changes the subject next week. We'll see if it's like that. I can only hope on this occasion that it is like that, because otherwise we will see something playing out that we've not seen playing out before, namely a trade war between the UK and the EU, with significant ramifications for all people in these islands, and indeed for a permanent loss of standing of the UK in the eyes of at least the democratic administration in the United States.
So a bit of brinkmanship, and hopefully we can pull folks back from the brink. How should we
brinkmanship with a tiny mouse?
Yeah,
sufficient for Donaldson to do the business. We'll see.
Yeah. So how should we read their purported refusal to support the election of a speaker in the Assembly in this light? How does that factor in to understanding of what's happening right now?
Well,
on these
Clare
issues?
may correct me here. I think the DUP's fear is that if you elect the speaker under the modified rules, the Assembly can function and the executive ministers can, in principle, then be voted on. Obviously, if the DUP don't fill the first ministership, a zombie executive continues in existence, but the Assembly would come to life and its committees could at least be engaged in daily business. So the DUP, if it is blocking the speaker and it continues to block the speaker, basically doesn't want the Assembly to start functioning.
Claire, did you want to speak to this as well?
Yeah, Edwin Poots did an interview on one of the local channels here last night, and he used the phrase, and I'm paraphrasing slightly because I can't remember his exact words, but it was basically sometimes things need to be brought to a head to be sorted was the gist of what he said, and very much he was projecting a view that the DUP's position is that there's no point in going soft on this issue if you're going to really try and show a strength of hand with regard to the protocol and to really try and force the hand of Boris Johnson and the team in Westminster, then you need to push all possible buttons available. So certainly the indication, listening to Edwin Poots, the way he was speaking last night, was that they're very much set on the idea that they won't nominate a speaker. Who knows what will happen by this time tomorrow, of course. But certainly there is a degree of thought within the DUP that essentially they'll do whatever it takes to get the changes that they want. And I think at this stage, they're possibly at least some of those more extreme thinkers within the DUP, or those who take a harder line with regard to the protocol, are certainly minded that if it is the case that you need to effectively ensure that the Assembly can function as well as the executive, then that's the route that we need to go down. But whether or not there's a genuine belief that that's actually something that's wanted. As a broad consensus within the party, I'm not so convinced at the moment, again, for the reasons I've highlighted around what they know and they're hearing from the doorsteps. Certainly some of the interviews other representatives have been giving on local media, there's the sense that they're very acutely aware and want to get back around the executive table. Whether that's just hearsay or not is perhaps another conversation. But certainly I think there's a sense that if they don't facilitate the election of a speaker tomorrow, that probably they're hoping something will be sorted out sooner rather than later. But you have to balance that with what I was saying earlier about Jeffrey Donaldson remaining in Westminster, which in itself is an indicator that things are expected to be protracted and drawn out. Of those two individuals, Edwin Poots, Jeffrey Donaldson, from very different ends of the DUP, it's worth highlighting. But it shows that even within the DUP, I think that there's a split in terms of where the thinking is around how things should progress with this issue.
So the historically pro-devolution party is willing to destroy devolution, to have devolution on its terms.
That sort of brings us to some of the other questions that have been submitted both beforehand, and there's a couple in the chat I'd like to pull in. And this one speaks to sort of just what you just said. And how should the UK government respond if there is a prolonged period without an executive? So are we looking at a return to direct rule?
So direct rule is would be a violation of the Good Friday Agreement, and in my view would be, although I can predict it recurring, I can't say that I would approve of it. What I think is important is to think about how you incentivize the DUP. And if the DUP thinks the protocol is bad, the DUP would think that a British government cooperating with an Irish government through the Intergovernmental Conference would be even worse. Now, that institution exists. In my view, both the Dublin and the London governments made a mistake in mothballing it between 2007 and 2017. It was originally designed both to encourage power sharing devolution and to be a mechanism for intergovernmental monitoring of the arrangements. When the two sovereign governments took their attention elsewhere in the belief that everything was stable, that's when things went wrong. So in my view, the appropriate way to respond to a sustained crisis is to convene the two sovereign governments with the parties and go through the painful, laborious, tedious process of producing another agreement. That would be better than a unilateral shift back into direct rule. But that's where we could go, because the Conservatives are not enthusiastic about sharing anything with any other sovereign government, as we now know.
Thanks, Brendan. Clare?
Yeah, I think probably we have this really frustrating cycle here where there's an election, there's a period of political instability, there's a bit of time where people are like, we don't know what's going to happen yet. Then the parties get back around the table, they produce a new agreement, and then they get back going and repeat and repeat and repeat. So I think we are going to see something quite similar to that this time round. But the big difficulty with it all is that the protocol is where the main source of contention is, and the protocol is an issue that, unlike in the past, it's something that can't be dealt with within Northern Ireland. It's very much Westminster level that issue rests with. So it's difficult to say at this point what sort of talks would be necessitated, but you would imagine that if it's seen that the DUP gets a concession with regard to the protocol, for example, that Sinn Féin then would turn around and ask for something that it would see to be reciprocal. And then if you have the Alliance Party in the mix now as well, will they ask for something potentially around institutional reform or something to that effect? You know, you don't know what way those dynamics will start to play out. But I think the only thing that is absolutely certain at this point in time is that we're in for a pretty rocky road for the foreseeable. It is going to be difficult. I don't think there's any interest in there being another election before 2022 is out. But it's what way everything will shake down, and what form that will take to get things back and going again. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all to see another, I don't know, New Decade, New Approach Mark II or something to that effect coming forward. There's still aspects of it even to be implemented and to be taken effect.
With elections called at the appropriate moment to concentrate DUP minds.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Presumably the clock is ticking, right? There's a 6-month window in which to get things up and running.
Yeah, we always say that, but Westminster is sovereign, so Westminster can change the rules.
Okay, there's a few more questions here. One is, has there been a surge in Northern Irish residents getting Irish citizenship in order to enjoy EU citizen benefits? And if yes, in what groups and communities?
The answer is yes, if we believe official passport issuing data. There was a report recently in the Irish Times saying that for the first time, more people took out or renewed Irish passports than UK passports. I think it will depend largely on whether people had 5-year or 10-year passports. And clearly that data doesn't tell you how many people are taking out both. I think there are quite a few liberal Protestants who are very happy to support the Irish rugby team, to have an Irish passport, and yet want to retain the Queen and to keep the United Kingdom. So we shouldn't overly fetishize choice of passport. On the day, I think it was almost the day after Brexit, Ian Paisley Jr. encouraged his constituents to apply for Irish passports so that they would keep the citizenship benefits that derive from EU citizenship rights. So it's an interesting shift, but I'm sure many people who are Scottish who have British passports don't necessarily abandon the wish for Scottish independence because they have a British passport.
Sure. Claire, did you want to speak to this question as well?
Yeah, no, that was the same info that I was going to draw on for that as well. And just, yeah, I guess just to reiterate that holding a passport for some people might be an outward symbol of their identity, but for a lot of people, it's also just a ticket of practicality. And we're hearing reports of now the travel's starting again, long queues at airports and so forth. And if people are hearing that, and there's an option there for having a passport that'll remove those potential obstacles, then practicality can sometimes supersede identity in national or constitutional terms. So yeah, I'm always cautious about reading too much into what people are doing with regard to passports in that sense.
Perfect, thanks. So we've got one more question here, and then we'll move towards some final thoughts. So maybe I'll go to you first, Claire, on this question. What should we make of the SDLP's performance, especially in light of its successes in 2019? Is this a case of the focus on the possibility of a nationalist first minister causing it to lose votes to Sinn Féin, or do we see the results of a growing divide between its younger, more socially liberal members and its older, more socially conservative wing, or both, or something else?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, the SDLP haven't actually received a lot of proper attention. All the focus has been on Sinn Féin, DUP and Alliance. So yeah, the SDLP is quite an interesting case. And I think the example points that were outlined there, all of those feed into the explanation for what happened at the election. Part of it, and we touched upon it earlier, is around the I guess, a more liberal nationalist type view, and where those votes are directed, particularly if you're looking, for example, on the issue of abortion, where will those votes be directed? And we've seen, there was a trickle of votes towards Alliance and some towards Sinn Féin as well. Was it in any way influenced by this narrative around the First Minister? Possibly for some. I would be surprised if for some people it didn't dictate to it. Certainly in my own area, I know people that would be SDLP voters who were happy to give preferences to Sinn Féin where they wouldn't have in the past, on the basis of, well, at least if my person doesn't get in, maybe it'll make some sort of a change. So there's, I don't want to overplay it, but I do think there is an element there for people who are more inclined to think about the symbolism of First Minister, Deputy First Minister, that we're more open to the idea of that. But I think fundamentally for the SDLP, their problem was a much more basic political one, insofar as Colm Eastwood, at the top of the chain, party leader, was doing well in these later debates. He was very visible during the election campaign, never afraid of speaking out, and getting engaged in televised conversations and debates. But that didn't really trickle down through the party, and they struggled within a lot of constituencies, not so much on the basis of the votes being around the party itself, but in a lot of cases around the candidates that they selected. So there's an issue there in terms of that feeding up through the party, the way that they are mobilizing and organizing themselves on the ground, the way that they're attracting new members into it and encouraging and supporting those members then to seek elected office. There's a little bit of a bottleneck going on within the party, on my reading of the situation anyway at the moment, where that just isn't really happening. So you have this top echelons of the party that's doing well, but actually on the ground it's struggling a bit. We're talking some really key constituencies for the party where the likes of South Down, for example, which would have been a stronghold for the SDLP in the past, isn't anymore. They actually lost a seat in this election. So it's one of those ones that's actually a relatively normal kind of political problem that we're seeing with the SDLP, I think anyway, insofar as it's about what's happening within the party as opposed to those macro level pictures of what's happening within nationalism. I think anyway is the stronger explanatory factor for what we saw last week than those other elements that we discussed there.
Thanks,
So
Clare.
I would like to emphasize a couple of local factors that Clare didn't mention. One is Derry. Lawrence Cooley's question talked about how well the SDLP did last time. They did well in Foyle and they did well in South Belfast. They did well in Foyle because there was a reaction against the local Sinn Féin leadership. Sinn Féin decisively addressed that, removed the people who were irritating the local community and replaced them with fresh candidates who were successful in Foyle. So the party appears there to have nipped in the bud a potential problem that could have led to loss of support in Derry. In South Belfast, where Clare Hanna was elected MP, apparently it looked like decisively. If you look at the Assembly election results, Sinn Féin got a full quota and Alliance came close to getting 2 quotas and was able to return 2 candidates. So Clare Hanna's success is entirely the result of Sinn Féin allowing her to run in that seat and getting Alliance votes on that occasion. If Alliance runs against her the next time in South Belfast, she will have to become very, very nationalist to get Sinn Féin votes and to get Sinn Féin to agree to support her again. So SDLP presence, in my view, in Belfast is hanging by a thread. Sinn Féin is the dominant nationalist party. It's organised. It has lots of very capable cadres in the way that Clare was emphasising. The SDLP looks elderly, and as I mentioned earlier, maybe Lawrence wasn't here for this, it lost young cultural Catholics because of its conservative position on social liberal questions, gay marriage, abortion, and so on.
Thanks. So we're just about out of time, but what I'd like to do is give you each maybe about a minute just to sort of share any final thoughts or any sort of reflections on where power sharing might go from here coming out of this election. So maybe I'll start with Brendan and then I'll give the final word to Clare.
So in the period ahead, up until we're going to operate under the canopy of a future referendum, not knowing when it's going to be. There is no alternative to power sharing, but there are 2 forms of power sharing, one where the executive functions and one where it doesn't, and we spend time trying to restore the executive or tweak the rules. No one should conclude from this experience, I think, that power sharing is wrong. It's addressing the right question, the deep historic cleavage between nationalists and unionists. The system is not biased against the others, and if the others successfully extend their appeal, they will be able to modify the system over time. So 2 cheers for the outcome. It shows that reform can happen. A nationalist is entitled to be the First Minister of Northern Ireland. There are things that still need to be reformed. It is, to my mind, a much deeper injustice that no nationalist can supervise the Ministry of Justice. The second thing, big theme, apart from the fact that there is no alternative to some forms of power sharing for the time being, is everything here is precarious because of Westminster's sovereignty. It hangs like a sword of Damocles over these proceedings. And we spend our time speculating on the interior mind of a British Prime Minister. That is a very weird set of constitutional arrangements to inhabit, but unfortunately they are the norm.
Thank you, Brendan. Clare.
Yeah, if we're looking to the future of power sharing in Northern Ireland, my view is that it's still necessary. We still need it here. I think the processes that are built into the institutions that facilitate the removal of decision making insofar as how seats are allocated, for example, those things that are more automated are still a strength of the system, and ones that unfortunately I think we still need to rely upon to a certain extent if we're going to see progress. I think there is a conversation happening, certainly a different type of conversation around the institutions as they're currently designed, and looking forward to what might come in the future. I don't think we're set, as I mentioned earlier, for any sort of overnight change to how governance is done in Northern Ireland, but certainly I think we're on a course to thinking in a more mature way about what we need from politics, and just having the presence of an assembly and executive isn't enough anymore. People are minded now, they want to see it functioning. We have a new generation of voters now in Northern Ireland that weren't here in 1998, myself included, who are looking at things in a way where more is needed. There needs to be real tangible benefits and outcomes of devolution in Northern Ireland. And I think there's a gradual shift towards, I guess, a more normalised type of politics in that sense than we might have had in the past. In terms of the current picture, I think we're in a very difficult position. We're in for a very bumpy, protracted period of political difficulty for the moment. All of that rests with Westminster, and particularly the inclinations of the Prime Minister in terms of how he wishes to deal with the issues at hand. But I think I always try and end on an optimistic note, and I think certainly there are some positives to take forward, in that the fact that we're even having these conversations, that we're thinking about the future, that we're looking towards Northern Ireland in terms of being a prosperous, happy, contented place, for want of a better way of putting it, for people here in Northern Ireland, is something really, really positive to take from the situation. And come what may in terms of border polls or Brexit protocol, whatever the issues might be, if that's the sense that continues to prevail, then that's something that will carry the people of Northern Ireland through it all, hopefully.
Wonderful. Thank you, Clare. And thank you both so much for sharing your expertise and insights on the election. Thank you to the audience for some great questions, both beforehand and some lively discussion in the chat. And of course, thank you to Carlo and the Center for Constitutional Change for hosting this event. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I'll turn it over to Carlo just to wrap things up. So thanks everyone.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to contain my enthusiasm here, but this is just a fabulous, informative, thought-provoking panel that I thought brought the general and the very granular and the constitutional and the party political in such a wonderful, productive conversation. So thank you so much, Brendan, Clare, and Allison, and thank you all for joining us today. I think what I just said is borne out by the fact that nearly the entire audience stuck with us until the very end. So thank you. And I hope you will join us for our future events with the Center on Constitutional Change.